Okay, good evening. So this is part two of chapter 10. And when we left off last week, we were basically on this slide. We had just reviewed Masters and Johnson's research. We had just reviewed Kinsey's research, talked about the, um, the pros and cons, the criticisms um, uh, with Kinsey's research, and the next two slides I'm just putting up just for interest's sake. And this is research supported items that have been viewed between, and differences between men and women, most often shown by men. And for example, um, for sexual activity, right? Men actually begin masturbating sooner in life, and they have a higher overall incidence or occurrence of that. In other words, they masturbate more than women do. And whereas women typically, on average, begin masturbating later in the life cycle, and overall lifetime prevalence rates tend to be lower. Now, when it comes to like masturbation, for example, that is not considered an abnormal sexual functioning. Masturbation is quite normal, and the reason why I bring that up is there's a test question that you may see on that. Same thing if you go back to when we were talking about Ellis Havelock and his research on like nocturnal emissions and masturbation, right? Because in the Victorian age, it was determined that that men having nocturnal emissions, that it was bad for their health. That masturbation, was not good, was not considered normal, and that's absolutely not true, right? When it comes to men, they're more likely to recognize their own sexual arousal, where interestingly, and again, this is research supported, gender differences, is that women may be less likely to recognize their own sexual arousal. With men, they're typically touched and kissed less by their parents, they're cuddled less, whereas women typically have more of that kind of physical contact. Men typically have less physical contact with other men and then respond negatively when they're touched by another man, depending on the relationship, of course. And whereas with women, they respond more positively to being touched, and there's more physical contact. So just some interesting differences. Some other differences regarding friendship and personality, and of course, personality we're going to be talking about in the next chapter, chapter 11. So this will kind of tie into that. But with personality, they tend to be men tend to be more aggressive from an earlier age, whereas women, on average, and again, remember, I'm saying on average in general, because there are always going to be variations within each group as well. But women tend to be less aggressive from a very early age. Men tend to be more confident, they're more self-validating, typically have higher self-esteem, whereas on the other side, women, on average, as supported by the research, they attribute success to their external factors and failures to internal factors. So remember, if we talk about the, well, we're going to be talking about locus of control as well in the next chapter. So we haven't come up to that yet. But this would be indicative of different loci of control. And let's see, cognitive abilities. And this is where sometimes I might get accused of being sexist. I'm really not. This is what the research is just showing. that men generally are superior in math, though not always true, as I pointed out, and visuospatial skills. And women are slightly superior than men in verbal skills. So, all right. So moving on to the next section. So we're going to talk about sexual orientation. And if you'll recall from Kinsey's research, one of the things that he determined, he came up with this Kinsey scale, if you'll recall, from 0 to 6, right? 0 being exclusively heterosexual, 6 being exclusively homosexual, with gradations in between, and 3 being bisexual, equally attracted to men and women, right? Both sexes, both genders. You know, one of the questions that that researchers have been asking for many years is, what is it that causes homosexuality? You know, and typically, historically, it was thought that it was caused by different socialization, different familiar experiences. In other words, you know, some kind of environmental aspect of it, right? And the issue with that, however, is that if you really look at what's happening, both homosexual identifying individuals and heterosexual identifying individuals, and of course, bisexual, right? The continuum in between, show very similar experiences regarding socialization, family experiences, etc. So it doesn't quite explain, that doesn't quite explain the causes of sexual orientation. But what research has found is that there are genetic and biological differences, right? And mechanisms. There's differences in brain structure between, for example, between heterosexual and homosexual individuals. So why, you know, what it's kind of like chicken or the egg. What exactly does that mean? I'm not sure that the research has fully identified that, but it does appear that that it is biologically and genetically determined, and that the characteristic remains pretty stable throughout an individual's lifetime. And not to be confused with individuals, because there are reasons why a homosexual man, for instance, might get married, have children, right? And then later in life come out of the closet, so to speak. I'm not sure if that's really appropriate to say, but in other words, announce to the world, it's like, no, you know what, my sexual orientation is that I'm homosexual and or bisexual or whatever the case may be. But there's societal views that impact people's decision making. But overall, the research shows that it is a stable characteristic. So that married man was experiencing homosexuality, maybe not acting out on it, but as far as his attraction, even before he was married. I hope that makes sense. Any questions on that?
Yeah, there was a show this Sunday morning regarding about those about sexuality, about twins. I don't know if you got a chance to see it.
I did not, but there have been lots of twin studies regarding yes, homosexuality, and it's interesting when so you have two sets of twins that are identical. One is gay and the other one is not, right?
Yes.
And so again, you know, going back to the biopsychology chapter, right? This is where range of reaction, right, for genetic response would may be indicated, right? So that's a very difficult one. The other thing is and research also shows, and it's very interesting as well, because when it comes to twins, you have both. You have twins that identify as one's heterosexual, one's homosexual, and then of course you also have twins that identify as both heterosexual and twins that both identify as homosexual. The research also shows correlationally, not sure exactly what the relationship is, and this is typically with males, not so much with females, that if a male has an older brother, he has an increased chance of actually being a homosexual orientation. So, and right now we're kind of talking about heterosexual versus homosexual. I do want to point out that there is a continuum, right? And that we should not be leaving out, bisexual individuals, people who aren't sure, they're questioning, right? So there's a continuum. And I think I made this point during the last lecture on part 1 for this, that human sexuality is a lot more complex than sometimes we actually give it credit for, right? But no, I did not see that show, and but I have seen research on that. It was probably based on that research. That's too bad. Where did you happen to see that by any chance? Maybe I'll look there.
Yeah, it was nice.
Where did you see it? Was it on
Sunday morning, and the show in the morning that they got it.
Oh, okay. Do you remember what show?
That's how they call the show, the Sunday morning.
Oh, Sunday morning. Oh, CBS.
Yes,
CBS
CBS.
Sunday morning. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, I can look that up.
And actually, this is something new because now in the school, they try to teach it us all to get the involvement for learning new things with kids who have diversity parents.
Yes.
And that is also new for us because we need to start learning how to interact with those kind of issues too with the kids.
Yes.
Because for bully, for all the other stuff that, what he got to mamas, well, he got to that, stuff like that. And we have to be so conscious and so kind of understand them too.
Right. No, it's true. And that's another reason why we're having this this discussion. And of course, it is part of psychology and psychological research, right? But it is also important, to be armed with information so that when we're interacting with other individuals, we can be more informed and make better choices, if that makes sense. Sometimes we don't even know we have, other choices, right? And so I just had a question come in through chat, which is how many genders are there, which is a very good question, because that's what we're going to go into next. But before moving into gender identity, gender expression, right? Gender role, gender schema. I just want to kind of wrap up with sexual orientation. It's kind of the same as far as the continuum, right? Human sexuality could be viewed on a continuum. And as you're going to see, we're going to talk about gender being on a continuum as well. So let me. So I was going to show. I usually show these videos, but in the interest of time, I am not. They are posted. It's another 60 minutes story on exploring two brothers. And what's interesting when you watch it, it could also be, well, it's an older thing. So there's some stereotypical things on there that I'm not sure that I would necessarily say today, but it's still a really good thing. So if you get a chance, if you have the opportunity, I would check those out. So I'm going to skip past these. So here, before I skip past these, I mean, after I've skipped past these, here's the other thing that I want to talk about when it comes to sexuality. And I kind of referred to it in 2 slides ago, right? When we were talking about sexual orientation being a relatively stable characteristic over the lifetime. In other words, you know, somebody, they enter puberty, they mature, and they're having opposite sex attraction, same sex attraction, or both sex attraction. And I'm using that term lightly, again, keeping in mind that gender in and of itself is on a continuum, just like orientation. And when I refer to sex, I'm actually referring to biological sex, right? So genital attraction, right? So a homosexual, right? Maybe emotionally attracted to the same sex, obviously, the genitals of the same sex partner, etc. And there's been a lot of studies also on homophobia, and we'll touch on this again in the social psychology chapter, but I did kind of want to hit on it now since we were talking about sexual orientation. And so here's an example of an eye fixation study. And what they do with these is they do eye tracking, and they test individuals to see where their eyes go, how long their gaze is, right? How are they focusing, right? So the picture on the left and the picture on the right are of 2 different groups, men and women. Anybody care to take a guess which group has the eye fixations in the areas that you see there? For the most part, generally.
Left is a woman.
Left is woman, okay. Any others? So right would be men?
Yes.
Okay.
I would say the opposite. So the first side is men and the other is women.
Okay, so you're saying the left is men and the right is women.
Yeah.
Yeah. And let's see, some of the chats that have come in actually agree with that. And I will tell you that that is correct, that the men are actually checking out the other men, right? They're looking at the genital region. Now, that, in my opinion, would be also considered normal. It's just, research shows that that happens a lot. Now, the next part of the research with eye fixation studies and with also measuring erectile, and we're talking about with men, blood flow to the penis, measurements of penile reaction to certain pictures and images, have found, and there's been several different studies, that there is a link to homophobia and same-sex attraction. Now, there are some, it's not quite conclusive because I'll give you an example. So one example from the research, one of the criticisms from the research, when they did the original research, which was just measuring erections or penile reaction to heterosexual versus homosexual imagery, homoerotic versus heteroerotic imagery, was that the more homophobic the individual claimed to be, the greater the reaction within his penis toward the homoerotic over the heteroerotic imagery. So the issue with that is that that could also be a sign of anxiety, where he's getting nervous and is having a reaction, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that that person was having attractions. And so those were the first those were the first tests. Then they did later tests with the eye fixation, and then they found a little bit more congruence with that, indicating that there was some repressed same-sex attraction. So the old saying, you know, that you're protesting too much could be true. It's not necessarily true all the way around, but it is some very interesting studies that they have conducted. And again, why would an individual repress their homosexual or bisexual, or how shall I say, according to the heteronormative society, what would be considered atypical sexual behavior? Why would a person be hiding that? Well, the answer would be, oh, something came in on chat. Right, societal pressure, exactly. Societal pressure is definitely one thing. Family, fear of rejection. You know, there's lots of things that play into that. And that may also be why you see people who are homosexual get married. Although I think you're seeing that less, but I haven't, I should take that back. That's probably more anecdotal on my part. But I'm sure someone is doing some research on statistics on marriage licenses and things like that. You know, with same-sex marriage being approved in lots of places. Actually, the law of the land now, because of the Supreme Court. Also, younger generations tend to, for the time being, tend to be more permissive than older generations. So just lots of interesting things to think about when it comes to that. All right, so here's what we're going to do. So earlier a question came in about how many genders there are, and we're actually going to start this discussion right now. So what we're going to do is I'm going to set you guys up into breakout rooms in a moment. Just going to kind of explain what we're doing, and then I'm going to stop the recording. Then we're going to go into our breakout rooms, and this is kind of what I want you guys to do. Now, I know you know, you guys have been doing your homework, you've been doing your reading, so some of these answers you may already have, but I want to facilitate this discussion to help facilitate your learning and actually kind of getting a little bit of differentiation between these terms, because you'll need it for the exam. And yeah, and I think it's just helpful in general. So when I break you guys up into groups, what we're going to do, first thing you guys need to do is choose a note taker and a spokesperson. You know, we've done this before. And then in your groups, probably set off right away to try to define biological sex, gender, gender identity, gender expression, gender role, and gender schema. Do the best that you can. For instance, gender schema, you may not know too much about. However, if you recall from the previous chapter, what the definition of a schema is in general, you might be able to come up with that. And if not, you know, we're gonna discuss it anyway. And then here's some discussion questions for you guys to ponder and kind of talk about. So first of all, have you ever encountered a situation in which you did not know another person's gender? Now, I don't know if anybody here, I'm a Billions fan, and
Yes.
yeah, and so there is a non-binary character on Billions, and I said she, they, sorry, that's the proper way, they identify that in real life. So the role that they are playing is also the role that they live, which is very interesting. But the very first time I personally ever saw that, I was like, oh, okay. And you know, this is why it's important to have these discussions. I think that it is normal for human beings when they come up against something or they interact with something that is novel, new, never before experienced, right? There can be lots of different reactions to that. And what's cool about having this discussion, and of course, we're going to see a video shortly and have more discussion on this, is now that we get to have a like a sober kind of discussion around this, and hopefully something that will be helpful. I will say this: words do matter. If you'll recall from the first part of from the very first lecture, you know, so we want to be mindful. I understand there may be word slippages, and obviously we should all be patient with that. For instance, the one that I just did by calling Asia by a particular gender when they identify as they, right? They or them. And so even I make those mistakes. So we're not talking about mistakes, but we do need to be mindful that in class, this is what I always say, you never know who is sitting next to you. You don't know what their experience is. You don't know who they're related to. You don't know what their experiences are, right? So just be mindful of that when we have these discussions. So if you ever encountered a situation when you did not know a person's gender, and if you have not had that experience, you might be imagining it right now, right? So what might that be like for you? What internal reactions might you have? How might you respond to that individual, or how did you? And I threw the last one in here because, you know, I know some of you are going to go on to counseling and social work or nursing, right? So what might you do if you are unsure about a client's or a patient's gender, right? How might you approach that? So that will be the discussion. And I'm going to stop the recording now so I can break you guys up into rooms, and then we'll pick it back up afterwards. Okay, so we're back from the discussion, and what I'd like to do now is I'm going to show you guys this video, and it's Sam Killerman, and he does this routine on gender. It's entertaining and quite informative, and I really like how he presents it. And so we'll watch that, and then afterwards we'll go on break, and then we'll come back and wrap up chapter 10.
So I'm not gay. Thank you. I'm not, but I find myself saying that a lot. You could go so far as to say that I'm professionally not gay, which is weird, because my life revolves around a comedy show called It's Pronounced Metrosexual, where I go on stage and I talk about identity and snap judgments and sexuality. But the funniest thing about all of this is that none of it really has anything to do with sexuality. The reason why I started doing that show, and the reason why people always assume I'm gay, has nothing to do with sexuality. It's all about gender. Gender and sexuality are often lumped together, but they're two different things. It's like apples and sexy oranges. Not the same thing. They're certainly related, but they're independent concepts, and it's important to realize that one does not dictate the other. Today I'm going to be talking about gender, not sexuality. Gender is something we all learn about as kids, but we learn a very limited concept of a concept that's truly unlimited. What we learn as kids is it's just incomplete. It's pieces of the puzzle, but it's not the full scene. Now, in case you didn't grow up in the States or missed it growing up, I'm going to give you a quick rundown on gender as it's taught here. Maybe you'll relate. Take all people and divide them into two. Boys line up on the left, girls line up on the right. Boys, let's start with you. Boys are aggressive, impetuous, good at math, love the color blue. They get dirty, roughhouse, play sports, but not house. Trucks and soldiers and Legos are their toys, but they break them all, because boys will be boys. Boys can grow up and be whatever they want. The world is their oyster, and whether or not they realize it's their privilege to capitalize on this prize that's limited just to guys, it's there for them. The Y chromosome prize. Boys have no limit. The bar is as high as it can go. There is no extent to their privilege unless they want to be a nurse, because that's kind of gay. Right? Girls, on the other hand, are docile, passive, natural caretakers. Love the color pink, born to be good bakers. Girls hate bugs, love hugs, and are better at vacuuming rugs. Science. Dolls and purses and makeup make their days. While boys play with video games, girls would rather play with hairspray. Girls grow up to be moms and leave the other jobs to dads, unless they want to be a teacher, a nurse, a receptionist, or a clerk. Now, what I just described certainly applies to a few of you. Yeah, there are people for which these descriptions end up being true. The problem here is options, and if you're counting, we have only two. Two options to describe every person in this room, each and every one of you. Two options to describe every person in this world. 7 billion individual identities, simplified into two. Now, as you can probably guess, gender isn't really that simple. It's true. In fact, there are as many versions of gender as there are a number of you. What I'm going to talk about tonight is a lot to wrap your mind around. But don't worry, I'm here to break it down. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not. That's not happening. It's not happening. Not at all. Not even a little bit. The easiest way to understand gender is to break it into 3 distinct pieces. 1, gender identity, which is who you in your head know yourself to be. More on this in a bit. 2, gender expression, the ways you present gender through your actions, dress, and demeanor. And 3, biological sex, the physical characteristics you're born with. This will all get clearer. Let's start with biological sex, the physical traits you're born with and develop that in many people's eyes equals gender. We understand biological sex to be made up of a bunch of different things. Chromosomes, hormones, hip-to-shoulder ratio, breast size, voice pitch, just to name a few. But we always think of one thing, reproductive organs, aka penises and vaginas, right? We equate gender to penises and vaginas. But here's the thing, gender is not universal. Gender is not cross-cultural, and gender changes over time. You know what is universal? Penises and vaginas. You know what is cross-cultural? Penises and vaginas. And you know what doesn't change over time? Actually, evolution. Sorry. But for the last 2,000 years, penises and vaginas? You know what you weren't expecting me to yell on stage? Penises and vaginas. I'm sorry, I'm having a moment. Okay. Back to reality. What I'm trying to say is that while biological sex is something that exists in a uniform and predictable way, something that can be measured around the world by scientists without much debate, you can't say the same thing about gender. Gender is relative. Gender is cultural. And gender, the way we express and understand it, changes over time. But we still connect biological sex to gender. If someone is born with a penis and testicles, he's a male. He's a he, and we raise him to be a him. If someone is born with a vagina, she's a female. She's a she, and we raise her to be a her. And when we're not sure, when someone is born intersex with ambiguous genitalia, we guess. We guess if he's a he or she's a she. And based on that guess, we raise him to be a him or her to be a her, which, as you can probably guess, can be problematic. And it's not just problematic to assign gender based on sex in people who are born intersex. And I'll get to that in a minute. First, I want to talk about gender identity. I'm going to say this again because it's something that needs to be said. Gender isn't the parts that make up your body, it's what's in your head. To understand the difference between gender identity and biological sex, we need to first make sense of what's in our heads. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. Shakespeare said this 200 years before we had a word for sociology. But Will knew his stuff, and in every way he was a prodigy. And what he said here rings true in my ears all these years later as I'm thinking about norms and folkways and what Durkheim called mores and all the scripted roles we play in our day-to-day without even real... Okay. Had another moment. What I'm trying to say is that what Shakespeare said about the stage, he hit the nail on the head. At birth, you're cast in a play, given a role, given a script, and told to play that part till you're dead. The directors in our plays follow us around every day of our life. The directors are our parents, our teachers, our peers, our preachers, news broadcasters, book writers, TV show producers, firefighters. Every person in your life who has an impact on you knows the script you've been given and knows when you've been missing your cues. And as we grow up, we become directors in other people's plays. We know when a little boy isn't playing the little boy part right, or when a little girl is running astray. All that's sociology. But it's important to have a grasp on it if you're going to have a grasp on gender identity, because gender identity is rooted in sociology. It's rooted in gender norms and roles, and the way that we perpetuate and reinforce those ideas in society. Your gender identity is how you make sense of yourself in your head and how much you align or don't align with what you understand the options for gender to be. Now, those options and your understanding of them are based on how you were socialized to understand what gender is. And that'll be different from continent to continent, country to country, state to state, even person to person. But for the most part, we have a shared idea as a society what it means to be man, woman, or other. Gender identity is, at its root, a way of classifying personality. But we have way more than two personalities. So why do we settle for gender options that are binary? Well, we don't. Not all of us, anyway. Let me give you a rundown of some gender identities I know of, and I'll try to do it alphabetically, but I can assure you that's not my strong suit. Agender, bigender, genderless, genderqueer, gender fluid, man, non-binary, non-gendered, trans, third gender, transgender, transsexual, transvestite, two-spirit, woman. I could keep going. That's more than two, so we can leave it at that. I don't have time to define all those terms for you, but they're easy to look up. That's what the internet's for. Well, and porn, but don't do that. What I do want to say is that the thing that binds all those identities together, the reason why they exist is because there are groups of people who were so not man or woman that they needed a whole new label to apply to them. These are people who historically have been labeled as having a psychological condition. Gender identity disorder, gender dysphoria. They've been called troubled, confused, and sick, a danger to themselves and our moral fabric. When in reality, it's society that's confused. Our understanding of gender as binary is sick. And to make someone confined to one of two options when in their minds they know that that role isn't for them, take the script away, mark it up with a pen. This isn't the role I was born to play. I know myself better than you could ever know me. And who are you to say what's healthy when your idea of health is destroying a part of me? Our understanding of gender as binary isn't just incomplete. It's dangerous. In a recent study in the UK, 84% of trans people reported that they had considered suicide. Half of them attempted it. They did this because they didn't feel welcome. They didn't feel right. They didn't fit. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that gender identity or non-binary gender identity is a dark thing, or at least it shouldn't be. We just need to shed some light on it. So I've talked about biological sex, penises and vaginas. I've talked about gender identity. I want to talk about gender expression, which is a different thing entirely. I'm a man. It's probably not a surprise for most of you to hear that, because I'm so manly. Why do people laugh when I say that? When no one doubts my male identity, right? The answer to that question is the difference between gender identity and gender expression. People laugh when I call myself manly because even though they don't question my manness, they question my masculinity. I'm a man who wears pants too tight, colors too bright, my voice is a bit too high, and my hair is just right. And to be forthright, I cry during Lion King, and if you don't, I think you're dead inside. I clean up well, and I smell delightful, and I use words like cute and, well, delightful. Gender expression is all that and more. It's the ways we present ourselves and what those things stand for. Gender expression changes from culture to culture because what gender means in ours means something completely different in another. We tend to think of gender expression as existing on a scale from masculine to feminine, when in reality it's two separate scales and a measurement on each of them. On one scale, we can measure how much we express femininity. All those things I told you about myself would increase that exponentially. But on the other scale, we measure masculinity. Does me having a beard make my salmon pants less girly? No, not really, but it does increase my masculinity. Slightly. Gender expression changes quite readily. In some cases, it changes from activity to activity. Think of an average day for you. Here's how one starts for me. I wake up, hair matted to the side of my head, drool on my face, wearing boxer briefs, grumbling obscenities. It's at this point in my day that I express most masculinely. But it changes quickly, because step one of my day is going to the bathroom, getting full-on pretty. I hop in the shower, shampoo my hair off of Pooey Ginger, leave-in conditioner, facial scrub, full body wash, hop out the tub, smell like a flower. And then I pluck my eyebrows. I'll do my hair, try on outfits in front of my mirror, which I'm sure is something all the guys do in here. Am I right, bros? No? Then I hop on a bus. I'll do phone call meetings for my nonprofit and work in bro-y phrases like dude and bullshit, because in that part of my life, and I hate to admit it, expressing masculinity is a pretty big benefit. And then I go to a cafe, order a black tea, and sit quietly, working and keeping to myself throughout the day. So in just a few hours, I've expressed both masculinity and femininity. In just the few minutes I've been on the stage, I've done the same thing. And it's something you've been noticing, even if just subconsciously. A lot of people express the gender that aligns with their gender identity. Some people don't, whether it's for comfort, pleasure, or personal creativity. And for some people, gender expression is a performance, a display of hyper-masculine or femininity. You've probably heard of these people. We call them drag kings and drag queens. So let's wrap this all together. Let's put this all together. I've talked about a lot in a very short amount of time. I tried my best to condense it down and make it understandable. I made it rhyme. But gender isn't something you're going to fully understand in 15 minutes. If I were to write a book about gender, it would be very hard to do in under 200 pages. And I know that because I wrote a book about gender, and it was very hard to do it in under 200 pages. But we still talked about a lot, so let's recap. 1, let's all agree that gender is more complex than what we learn as kids. 2, while biological sex is certainly a component of gender, it is not a determinant. That is, the biological sex characteristics you're born with don't really have any mandate on who you'll grow up to be. People who are born with penises are taught to be boys. People who are born with vaginas are taught to be girls. 3, gender identity, how you make sense of gender in your head, sometimes aligns with your biological sex, and sometimes it doesn't. 4, your gender expression is a separate thing entirely. It's how you present gender to the world, and sometimes it aligns with your biological sex and your gender identity, and a lot of times it doesn't. And 5, let's all agree that gender as we learned as kids is not as complex as it should be. Now, I know that that was number 1, but it's also number 5, because it's very important. In my ideal world, well, let's put it this way. Socrates said, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." After this talk, I hope that this talk will serve as a catalyst in helping you realize how little you actually know about gender, as well as an inspiration to open your mind and be willing to learn more. We're all constantly learning about gender, and we have time to do that, but you have to be willing to. You have to be willing to unlearn all the things you learned as a kid and open your mind up to some stuff that might freak you out. But that's what it's all about. Now, in my dreams, I don't foresee a society that is gender blind, but I do foresee and wish for one that's gender creative, where people can figure out who they are and be themselves, exploring what that means, and in that they'll be supported. Where questioning one's gender won't be shunned, but an expectation. And we're realizing that you don't fit into this gender mold won't lead to isolation and depression, but will be a source of celebration. And above all, a society where people, regardless of their gender formation, are safe. But in the meantime, can we at least get some gender-neutral bathrooms up in this piece? Thank you.
All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and take our break. It is, let's see, what time is it? It is 7:25.
7:25.
Yeah, so let's come back at 7:45. That gives everyone 20 minutes, and we're going to wrap this up, this discussion, and go through those definitions that we were talking about before. So make sure that we're all clear as we could be, right? All right. Enjoy your break, and I'll see you when you get back. Okay, so we're coming back from break and continuing our discussion on gender, gender identity, gender expression, etc. So great discussion. There's obviously a lot of learning that is happening. And so I kind of want to focus on one thing that was mentioned by Sam Killerman in the video when he discussed gender dysphoria. And it is in your book. And this is why we are discussing it now. There is some controversy on that. Basically labeling someone who is that does not identify as their gender as being dysphoric in some way. In other words, having some a disorder, right? Diagnosable disorder. And I do want to point out, when we were talking about sexual orientation, that homosexuality was listed in the original DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for disorders, as a mental health disorder as well. And of course, the more we learn over time, that was actually removed from the DSM and is no longer considered a disorder. So a homosexual person is not considered to be disordered. At some point, I would imagine that then gender dysphoria would probably go the same way, but unfortunately, that is not up to me. We are teaching this because it is in the DSM, and it was in your reading, and so I kind of wanted to have a discussion around that. Let's see. Okay, so oops, sorry, hit the wrong button. Okay, so back to our gender discussion, right? So as I said during the discussion, one of the reasons why I kind of wanted you guys to have that discussion is to explore what you know, what you don't know, what beliefs you may have. And then we all came back together and then had that discussion. And so after viewing the video with Sam Killerman, who I think is pretty clear, these are the definitions that I want you to take away, right? So biological sex, right, is related to one's biological and anatomical characteristics, or as Sam likes to say, penises and vaginas, right? And I think that's pretty easy. I don't think anybody would have any problem with that, understanding that. Gender is the psychological and sociocultural meanings that are added to the state of being male or female, right? So these are things that get assigned, right? Now you'll notice gender identity is not here yet. That is on another slide. It's coming up. But gender is the sociocultural meaning, what we add to it, right? Gender expression, as some of you rightly pointed out during the discussion, is related to the way that one expresses their gender, typically through their appearance, their dress, their behavior, right? And then gender role is what is societal's expectations for normal and appropriate behavior for your biological sex. And finally, gender schema relates to the belief that children actively create internal rules about appropriate gender behavior, right? girls play with dolls, boys, play cowboys and Indians, whatever the case may be, right? Or they play soldier, right? They do boy things, and girls do girl things. That's kind of like those gender schema, and those are the internal rules that are created. But here's the main takeaway that that I think Sam was pretty clear on, and that I have been trying to be clear on, is that sex and gender are not the same. Now, having said that, most people identify, have a gender identity that matches their gender expression, their gender role, and their gender identity. For example, and I don't think Sam said this in the video. He might have, I might have missed it, but cisgender is another way to describe, right? So my name is Richard. I am a cisgender male, and my preferred pronouns are he and him. And so what does all of that mean? What does that? That means that I identify as male. It matches my biological sex. It matches my gender role. It matches my gender expression. There's no incongruence there. So I have never had to think about my gender identity, my gender role. I've never had to think about that. That is not true for every single human being on the planet. And we're going to explore the case of David here shortly, which is, we'll get into this a little bit deeper. Let's see here, 2 chats. Let's see. Let's see. So one of the students says, I found it interesting that he only felt the need to apologize when expressing masculinity at his job and not when he was expressing femininity. Yeah, that is interesting, right? And the way he puts it is that, yeah, this is how I took it, as this is my interpretation, is that he needed to be that way because it is beneficial for his job, which the subcontext there, of course, we would have to talk to him a little bit further, may indicate that he doesn't feel free to be himself when he's in those situations. Again, another one of those constructs that we have. So it's a good thing to point out there. Okay, so gender identity, which was missing from the first slide, from that slide, I put it here on purpose, refers to one's sense of being male, female, etc. Right? And the etc. is because they may feel as though they're non-binary. But here we have Chaz Bono, right? He was born the daughter of Sonny and Cher. Chaz is a transgendered male. His preferred pronouns are he and him, and his gender expression is also male, right? No longer wears dresses, wears suits, coats, ties, etc. So gender identity refers to one sense of being male, female, etc. So I'm not going to show you the video, but we are going to talk about it. It was presented in the book as well, and this is one of those situations where, kind of like a case study, right? So to explore gender, it would not be, or gender identity, it would not be ethical, right, to at birth change, assign, reassign someone's biological sex, like remove their penis and testicles and try to raise them as a girl just to see what would happen, right? That would be unethical. Remember when we talked in the research psychology chapter 2, that sometimes cases come up where there's an opportunity to explore something that has already happened. And so Bruce and Brian, they're Canadian, And they were born in the mid 60s, 1965, and but they were not circumcised at birth. And so as the result of that, they needed to go back because they were having urinary trouble. Sometimes with males who are uncircumcised, the foreskin does not retract all the way back. It can cause pain, it can cause problems, right? And so the decision was made to go ahead and circumcise both of the boys. They were twins, by the way. So the doctors recommended the circumcision, and during the circumcision, Bruce's penis was irreparably damaged. It was burned very, very badly. They were using oh, I forget what it's called now. But they were using an instrument that basically burns the foreskin off in order to remove it. And there was an accident, and it severely damaged his penis to the point where it was not going to be workable. It wasn't going to be operable. That something needed to be done. And so what ended up happening was the parents, trying to figure out what to do, reached out to an individual who believed that when humans are born, we are all born with a clean slate, that gender is not determined at birth, that we're taught, or that we learn about it as we go. So at 22 months, they removed his testes. They basically gave him vaginoplasty. In other words, they created a vagina, and Bruce was renamed Brenda, and to be raised as a girl. So these are pictures of the family here. So as Brenda was approaching adolescence, it became clear to everyone that she was having difficulty identifying as a girl. Brenda did not identify as a girl. Brenda was forced to take estrogen for breast development, and to also develop male characteristics, an Adam's apple, bone mass, all of those secondary male characteristics, or female characteristics, I should say. Sorry, I misspoke. At age 14, because he's experiencing distress. So imagine this. He was born male, loses his penis as a result of an accident. They decide to raise him as a girl, gets to puberty, and then begins to experience distress. I don't feel like a girl. I don't feel like a girl. And so they decided to, tell him the truth, and he decided to live as a male. And he was comfortable in that role. He felt good with that. He eventually got married. He had been infertile because they had removed his testicles, and I lost my train of thought. Sorry. So they weren't able to have kids, but they had the one child because she was a single mother. Now, Dr. Money at this time was still talking about the whole experiment as if it was a success, and used his findings to recommend the same course of action for intersex children. And so these are children that are born with either both male and female, vagina, penis, or some kind of abnormality that they're unable to determine, what the biological sex is. And as a result of that, the twins, David and Brian, came out and talked about the trauma that they experienced. And so the video that I did not show, it is posted. There's also an Oprah interview that he did where he talked about this. So this is an example of one of those case studies that clearly shows that that gender identity is more than just how a person is raised. Unfortunately, as a result of this, David ended up committing suicide in 2004. So, he would have been 39 years old at the time. And he really struggled for a long time over this entire situation. So looks like we got a couple of chats. There's some comments on the story. So the story of David, you will see this on the exam, and I wanted to talk about this, especially after having the gender discussion that we just had, because this is just further evidence that a person's identity, really, they know who and what they are, right? And talking about the discussion we had earlier about how would we interact with an individual who maybe we're not sure what their gender is. First of all, and I'm just going to express my own personal beliefs. I think personally, and how I try to handle it in my classroom is that every student has a right to the pronoun of their choice, to be identified as they choose, and that my job is as a fellow human being and as an instructor is to respect that choice. So if somebody introduced, and I have had this in my classrooms, where people prefer to be referred to the pronouns they or them. They're absolutely, that's what I will do. So having that discussion that we had before, it's okay to ask. Just realize too, on the other side of it, imagine I'm one individual and maybe I'm not sure how to respond to this individual. They, them, he, her, how the pronouns that they prefer, and then I make that error. I just need to clean it up. That's all. It's as simple as that. And realize that I'm one individual, but they are having it multiple times a day, right? So, all right. All right, so we already kind of talked about this. The belief that children actively create internal rules about appropriate behavior and gender behavior is consistent with either A, biopsychosocial theory, B, the androgyny hypothesis, C, social learning theory, or D, gender schema theory. And we've talked about that quite a bit. So it's obviously gender schema theory. So any questions on gender, gender identity, gender role, gender expression, pronouns? So remember, I'm a cisgender male and my preferred pronouns are he and him. And the reason why I do that, I will actually write that on the board when I'm in class, because then what that also does is it makes it okay for other people to express themselves as well. So that's why I do that. All right. Okay, so the next section we're going to move into is emotion, but I am having a situation here with my computer. So I'm going to stop the recording for a moment, clear this up, and start back up again here in just a second. Okay, we're back. So on to emotion, and we're going to talk about theories of emotion, some biology, and the facial expression and recognition of emotions in this next section. And so first we're going to talk about what is the difference between emotion and mood. And so mood is, think of it as your general state. These are prolonged, it's less intense. So like, I'll give you an example. So like today, I'm kind of in a good mood. I've been in a good mood all day. Right now, I can describe my emotion as I'm actually happy. I enjoy teaching students interacting, even if it is through Zoom. Hopefully we'll be back in classrooms soon because I love the one-on-one. But I still like doing this, right? So right now, my emotion, my subjective state is I'm happy. That's how I'm describing my feelings. But my mood for the day, which has been pretty much stable and prolonged, yesterday, hopefully tomorrow, generally pretty good mood, right? And so that's the difference between mood and emotion. And actually, it's funny because with mood, it says it may not be consciously recognized or intentional, right? So it wasn't until we got to this screen that I'm actually thinking about it, right? And it's just been my overall experience for today. Whereas emotion, it's like, yeah, I'm happy. I'm in a good mood. This is great. And I'm consciously telling you, I'm consciously thinking about it, and I'm consciously describing it to you, right? There's an intentionality behind emotions, right? So can be relatively intense also, and occurs in response to an experience, for example, teaching right now, or working with clients. It might be an example of that. And then the components of emotion that we want to talk about also is there is physiological arousal, there is psychological appraisal, and then there's our subjective experiences that goes into that. So remember, like on the exam, I always caution physiological, psychological, they can look kind of close together. So make sure you're taking the time to read so that you're understanding which answer might be correct or incorrect, what you might want to rule out. And the other thing about these components of emotion, everything that we're describing is informed by our background, right? So what background experiences have I had? What's my cultural experience, etc. So the question comes up, if someone asks how you are feeling, should we say our mood or our current emotion? That's a really good question. And I actually hadn't thought about that until right now. Generally, and I'm just going to speak from my own experience, right? Because if somebody asks me how I'm doing, I generally say I'm doing, okay. It depends on the situation. So it might be a descriptor of my mood in general, or if there is a specific stimuli, a specific situation happening, it can also be my emotion in that moment, right? Like a surprise party. You walk in the door, surprise, how's it? Somebody says, hey, how you doing? I'm like, wow, this is great. So that would be my emotional response to that specific incident. If I'm walking down the hall and somebody says to me, hey, how you doing today? And I go, you know what, I'm doing pretty good. That might be more descriptive of my mood. So I hope that makes sense. I'm not sure that there's a psychology definition of that. Here's one of the reasons why I look at emotion versus mood, affect versus mood, is when I'm working with clients, right? So a person's affect is what they're displaying in the moment: happy, sad, yeah, happy, sad. I'm just going to go with that: happy, sad, mad, glad, whatever, right? But their overall mood, in other words, that more general, more prolonged thing, might also be good, right? Or they might come in and say, I'm in a good, a good mood, but they're giving me a frown. So that would be incongruent. I would make note of that. Their mood is not matching their emotional affective state in that moment. So I hope that makes sense. But so people often confuse mood and emotion, and while they are linked, they're definitely linked. They are also, they're separate, right? And toddlers, anybody has any kids knows that that they can cycle through their emotions very quickly. I love these two pictures. So it can be happy one moment, and they can be very sad or mad the next moment, right? So let's talk about some theories of emotions, right? So first we have the James Lange theory. And their theory is that emotions arise from physiological arousal. So in other words, think fight or flight, right? So if you see a snake, your heart, your respiration rate is going to increase, right? Because you're in fight or flight. Your sympathetic nervous system has been activated, and that is physiological arousal, and you experience the feeling of fear. That's that theory. So remember that emotions arise out of physiological arousal. The Cannon-Bard theory is that physiological arousal and emotional experience occur simultaneously, yet independently. So in other words, they're occurring at the same time. So I see the snake, I experience the fight or flight, the physiological arousal, right? The sympathetic nervous system gets activated, and I simultaneously feel fear. But that is happening independently. Two different systems happening, but it's going on simultaneously. So in studying this, some empirical findings that they have found is that individuals with spinal cord injuries are incapable of receiving autonomic feedback, but still experience emotion. But in some, it's been reported that it's been less intense. And then also the suppression of facial expression of emotion also lowered the intensity of emotions experienced. And we're going to talk about the facial feedback hypothesis in a few slides. And then, so basically that the findings suggest that the psychological arousal is not necessary. I said psychological, see, even I do it. It's physiological arousal is not necessary in order to experience emotion, but does seem to be linked to the intensity of the emotion. That makes sense. So you can experience emotion without it, but intensity increases if there is physiological arousal. And then the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory gets a little bit more complex, right? So emotions are composed of two factors. So physiological and cognitive. So in other words, I'm having a physical reaction and then I'm thinking about it, right? There's some kind of assessment happening. So the physiological arousal is interpreted in the context leading to the emotional experience. So I see the snake, fight or flight response, and I'm also assessing it. What's the shape of that snake's head? Does it have a rattle, right? So there's a cognitive aspect of the situation. And as a result of that, I label it fear. And based on labeling it fear, I am now experiencing fear. So this theory also believes that psychological, there I go again, physiological arousal is very similar across different types of emotions, and that
it's the making of the cognitive assessment that is the important piece here. So palm sweating, heart racing, respiration rate, could be scared or could be nervous. And then Lazarus is the cognitive mediational theory. Excuse me. Emotions are determined by our appraisal of the stimulus. So unlike the Schachter-Singer model, the appraisal occurs before it's labeled. And that also the appraisal is immediate and unconscious. So there's a lot of similarities between these, and it can get confusing. There's a great, this is from your book, and this breaks down the four theories in a graphical way, right? So you can see the James Lange theory. Oh, let me see here. Turn on the laser pointer. So James Lange theory, right? So physiological arousal. I mean, you see the snake. That's the thing. Physiological arousal, and then you experience the emotion, which in this case is fear, which you can see on that gentleman's face. And then you have the snake again, and you experience the same thing is James Lange theory, but you're experiencing the two at the same time. And then the two-factor theory, you have the snake, heart pounding, then you have the cognitive label, I'm scared, right? And then you experience the emotion of fear. And then finally, you have the snake, you appraise it as being a threat. And as a result, you experience physiological arousal. So it'll be kind of important for you guys to be able to recognize the differences between those theories for the exam. And it can be confusing, so I highly recommend reviewing your homework and studying the chart. All right, let's talk about the biology of emotions. So I turned off, hold on 1 second, sorry, laser pointer. So this is obviously the brain. And what we're going to be talking about is what's known as the limbic system. And the limbic system, we've talked about it before, is involved in emotional response and memories, if you'll recall. So we have the hypothalamus, and then the thalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus, right? So those are all integrated. You remember that from the memory section, from the memory chapter, chapter 8. And so here we are at it again. So the amygdala, as you guys will recall, processes emotions, anger, fear also. The hippocampus integrates the emotional experience with the cognition. And you'll notice, so the amygdala and the hippocampus are very, very close together. And then the hypothalamus, which is involved in the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight, and also part of the emotional reaction. Also involved there is, within there is what's known as the basal lateral complex. And so that is dense connections with different sensory connections to different sensory areas of the brain. And this is what's also, if you'll remember from our learning chapter, classical conditioning, attaching value to learning and processing memory, right? That's all what is happening in the basolateral complex. And so the amygdala is part of that. And there's also the area known as the central nucleus. Right? So on the exam, do not confuse the amygdala with the basolateral complex. They are definitely connected, but there are going to be two different ways to answer that question. And you want to make sure that you understand the difference between the two. I'm going to go back just for a second. So the amygdala plays a role in processing emotion and information and sends it to other cortical structures. In other words, to different parts of the brain. And the basolateral complex, which has the amygdala involved, but it's dense connections with different sensory areas of the brain. And also, it'll be important to remember that it's connected with classical conditioning and attaching emotional value to that learning process. And the central nucleus, which is also in this area, is involved in attention, right? So that's what you want to know there. And then one other thing that the book talks about is the cultural display rule. And that is, for instance, different areas, different cultures will express emotions in different ways. So in the United States, for example, if we express negative emotions like fear, anger, and disgust, we do that both alone, and we also do that in the presence of other individuals, right? Whereas in Japan, they tend to only express these negative emotions while alone. So that's an example of cultural display rules. What's appropriate in depending on the culture. So despite this, right, recognition and production of facial expressions of certain emotions are universal. And there's a great diagram from the book, and here it is, where they have broken it down to 7 basic universal emotions that are cross-cultural, common to all humans. And they've broken it down into happiness, surprise, sadness, fright, disgust, contempt, and anger. In the United States, we may do all of these alone or in the presence of others, whereas in Japan, you probably would not see the disgust, the contempt, the anger, probably wouldn't see frightened or sadness, right? So again, looking at those cultural display rules. And then I had mentioned this earlier about the feedback facial hypothesis. And, asking the question, does smiling make you happy? Or does being happy make you smile? And the hypothesis is that facial expressions are capable of influencing our emotions. So sometimes when we're live in class, I'm not going to do it to you guys now because I'm not going to show your faces on YouTube, but we will go through an exercise where, you can do it right now. Nobody's going to see you. Where I make them sit there and smile for at least a minute, right? And then ask for their response to that exercise. And often, most of the time, people are reporting that it actually did make them happier, right? Like it did influence how they were feeling in the moment. And so some of the support that they've seen is that depressed individuals reported less depression after paralysis of their frowning muscles through Botox injections. Like, who knew? And so here's the formula here, right? So you have the emotional stimulus, you have the facial expression, physiological arousal, and then you have the emotional experience. So this is the facial feedback hypothesis. So you should just try it sometime. If you're not having a great day, go somewhere, sit and smile for 5 minutes and see what happens. And then we're just about to wrap up. There's a couple of things that I want to talk about with hunger and eating eating disorders that I want to get into. And first, if you'll recall from like drive theory of motivation, right? Homeostasis, that's something that I remember. I want you guys to learn that physiological homeostasis, right? Trying to maintain homeostasis, it can be a motivating factor. It's part of drive factor as well. But for physiological mechanisms here with hunger and eating, you know, you have an empty stomach, the stomach contracts. Everybody is very familiar with their hunger pains. And then there's chemical messages that basically travel to the brain to signal feeding behavior. The other thing is there's low glucose levels. Your pancreas and liver generate these chemicals that induce hunger and sends that information to the brain. And then we're motivated to eat at that point. Now, once we've eaten, right, we experience, I can never pronounce this right. Basically, we're feeling full, right? We're satisfied. And what that does is that signals us to stop eating. And what happens when that doesn't occur? And so we're going to talk about some, you know, like binge eating disorder, stuff like that here in just a minute. The other thing I want you to remember too is we'll talk about a couple of things. One, metabolic rate, and then set point theory. So when it comes to our body weight, everybody here in the classroom, we pretty much have a set point, right? That's the theory that basically says that all individuals have an ideal body weight, that's their set point, and it can be resistant to change. The other thing about set point is that it is genetically determined. So people who struggle with diets, right? So efforts to move weight significantly from the set point are resistant by compensatory changes in energy intake and expenditure. So it actually causes changes, right? The other thing about set point theory, though, it does fail to take into account the social influences and environmental influences. So the other thing is that body weight does generally fluctuate within a narrow range of a person's set point, according to the theory. All right, so some eating disorders that we're going to talk about here for a second. So first of all, there's bulimia nervosa, sometimes just referred to as bulimia. And that is when an individual is engaging in some sort of binge eating behavior. And then what they do after that is they attempt to compensate for the large amount of food that they've consumed by, you know, vomiting, using laxatives, doing excessive exercise. And the problem is that the psychological effects of that can be depression, anxiety, and there's an increased use or risk for substance abuse. So, which is interesting, like when I go in and I'm screening people for programs, one of the questions that I ask is, does a person have any concerns about their eating behavior, weight, any worries around that, right? Because we know that, especially for women, although it does happen with men as well, that eating disorders can co-occur with substance use disorders. So it can be important to try to figure that out. Because the other thing with eating disorders is that's a very specialized treatment program. Like, I am not qualified to do that, but if I detect an eating disorder, I would need to refer that out. The important thing that I'm trying to say here is that I actually kind of try to look for it. because if we don't look for it, it can be easily it can be missed. So bulimia is the binge eating with the purging. So think binge and purge. Binge eating disorder in and of itself involves binge eating behavior, but is not followed by purging. They just eat, eat. Usually there's a lot of weight gain with that, can have some health consequences just like the bulimia can. I did forget to mention that, right? So going back up to the bulimia nervosa, kidney failure, heart failure, tooth decay, those are all serious consequences. And then with binge eating disorder, you can have similar consequences, but severe weight gain, etc. And then last is anorexia nervosa that we'll talk about. And that's where an individual just has a distorted view of their body image. They look in the mirror, and even if they are not fat, they believe that they are. That's what they see. And the health consequences there is bone density loss, heart failure, kidney failure, reduction of the function of gonads, and it can also cause death. And it also co-occurs with anxiety disorders, mood disorders, and again, substance use disorders as well. And so just some other statistics, right? So Caucasian females ages 15 to 19 from Western societies, right? The United States, Europe, are at risk the most. They're at the highest risk. And some of the contributing factors could be the media, the messages about what an ideal woman should be looking like. Also, some other contributing factors, low self-esteem, other co-occurring mental health concerns, stress, life transitions, right? Personality types, which we'll talk about, type A versus type B. And then family issues can also be a contributing factor. All right, so I believe this will conclude chapter 10. Yes, it does conclude chapter 10. So don't go anywhere because we're going to start chapter 11 in just a few minutes. I'm going to stop this recording and get set up for the next.